Hello everyone, this is Samuel Chong, and today we have a guest. His name is Jesse Beltran. He's an expert on the Havana Syndrome. He was born in and raised in California, a retired firefighter paramedic from the city of Sacramento Fire Department. He was one of the founders of International Center Against Abuse of Covert Technologies, and is a certified master hypnotist with a diploma in hypnotherapy. He is currently writing a book called UNDUE INFLUENCE, Turning Your Suggestibility into Your Superpower. Welcome, Jesse. Thanks
Well,
for,
thank you, Samuel.
yeah,
Pleasure.
yeah.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure.
First, let me ask you, when are you going to publish your book, UNDUE INFLUENCE?
Yeah, well, I just, as of last week, we just finished, it's 12 chapters, 222 pages, about 100,000 words. So we're just going through the reciting and finding appropriate research footnotes, and then I would anticipate within the next 3 months we should have it
Great, great.
published.
Yeah, please let me know when it's published because I definitely would like to read it.
Yes, yes,
Yes.
exciting.
So,
Yeah.
so today we're going to talk about the Havana Syndrome. So for those of the audience that don't know what it is, could you please give a general introduction of what that is?
Okay. So the Havana Syndrome was first reported in 2014 by our diplomats who were, as our relationships with Cuba had started to soften, and our diplomats were there, and they started having unusual symptoms. And it wasn't just one person; it was many in the staff within the embassy. And the types of phenomenon they were complaining about, they were hearing strange noises. They were getting dizzy from this effect, and then they were having nausea and headaches, and then began to describe what was called brain fog. Um, it caused sleep disturbances, fatigue, and visual and auditory impairments. In fact, what was unusual is not only did it happen to the diplomats there in Cuba, it started to happen in other places throughout the world. And this was happening to not only our diplomats here in the United States, but it's happening to Canadian diplomats. It was happening to, I know personally because I had interviewed with individuals from the Secret Service, FBI agents, and initially it was thought to be maybe it was a induced sort of psychosis phenomenon or a group phenomenon that was happening. But it turned out that it wasn't, because they were doing MRI scans and they were finding there was actually some brain trauma associated with this. And the interesting thing is you had mentioned that I was one of the co-founders for the International Center of the Abuse of Covert Technologies. Is if we align these symptoms up with the phenomenon that we were tracking here in the United States since really early 2009, 2010, what we are reframing as domestic Havana Syndrome victims. This phenomenon started happening here in the United States and had been happening here in the United States for quite some time. And in my journey, and we can talk about in detail what the statistics that we were coming up with. And I also uploaded some of those statistics for you to have access to up in the file that I sent you. Mm-hmm. But essentially, I met a gentleman by the name of Dr. John Hall. He is a board certified physician. He's an anesthesiologist, and he's the head of many organizations, and he's an author of a book entitled, his first book was called Guinea Pigs: Technologies of Control, and then he followed up a subsequent book called Satellite Terrorism in America was his first book. Guinea Pigs: Technology of Control was the second book, and then he wrote about my efforts here in the United States and what we were finding, and eventually that took me abroad worldwide, where other governmental agencies had requested that I come see them, maybe even bring some victims that I thought that this was happening to there, from not only the United States, Europe, China, Korea, and Russia. The ones
Like,
that
like most of the countries that you mentioned are considered to be like not in alignment with the U.S. policies. Has that ever happened, for example, in the embassies of the U.S. In the UK or Germany or other like American-friendly countries?
it is happening, and it's happening worldwide. And the interesting thing is, this is happening to top-notch people. We're talking the cream of the crop, people who are considered just the elite of the elite. And these are the type of personality types that it's happening to. Now, initially, this was reported when we were following this phenomenon prior to 2014 to the Presidential Bioethics Commission that was put together under President Obama. And it was headed by Amy Gutman, who is now, I believe, the ambassador for us in Belgium. And literally hundreds of people would come and general public give testimony. And unfortunately, it fell on deaf ears. They tried to say it was a psychological disorder happening in mass hysteria, when in the case it wasn't. And I was invited to the second Presidential Bioethics Commission on topic on genetics in San Francisco, at the University of San Francisco Hospital, their teaching hospital. And I was allowed to write a question, and I posed this because they were talking about experimentation. And it's important for your audience to know what the agenda is. They believe they are the top 1% of the elite 1% that should make all decisions based on your body, your health, what should be done to you. They do not believe that we are smart enough or possess the ability to make sound decisions that are best for our own autonomy.
By saying they,
And
what do we mean by who are they? Like,
Amy Gutman, the president of the Bioethics Commission, this was televised worldwide.
got it.
In fact, if you look on the video, you'll see me and my assistant right there in the first row.
Mm-hmm.
And when I posed the question, my assistant wrote it down, and they took a break, and every news network was there across the world, NBC, ABC, CBS, everyone was there. And when I was getting ready to pose my question, all of a sudden I was told I can't ask the question. But I'll tell your audience what the question was. I stated it this way. I said, I know the importance of your research, but what safeguards are you putting aside for when your research goes wrong? What are you doing for those victims? And that was my question, only because it was important that those hundreds of people that went to the first meeting, it fell on deaf ears. And so this was a dynamic way to try to get them to answer that, or maybe open up their eyes that they really need to address that issue and make sure that if they are doing any type of experimentation, number one, that it be full informed consent, not partial informed consent, and that it is imperative that there is some type of remedy to help these people. Because what has been happening up until recently is that there are no resources for these victims. And I initially, it was hundreds, and now it's in the thousands, and now it's in the tens of thousands of people who are reporting this. So it's not only federal employees. And recently, the Department of Homeland Security gave testimony, and specifically about the Havana Syndrome. And they disclosed that, yes, this phenomena is happening. They claim that they do not know really the source of the phenomena. They claim that it is most likely coming from a foreign government. And they were asked the question, the witnesses there, and these were all sworn, they were all sworn testimony. and people who were formerly in high-ranking positions in our government agencies, our militaries, and research facilities, and some of them were journalists. And what they disclosed is that, yes, it is happening. They can confirm it's happening to federal employees. When they were asked the question, is this happening to non-federal employees, they skirted the answer. One of the witnesses there did state, though, however, if you look at his Twitter feed, judging by the responses of other people giving claims that this is happening to them, they discounted it. Their answer was they only look at federal employees and they don't have any statistics on the general population.
So this is happening to both federal employees and non-federal employees in the general public as well. But have you found
Correct.
any common traits of the people who have been affected by this whatever phenomena that's happening? Like in terms of their profession, their position in the society, like are there any common traits of the people who have this syndrome?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I can tell you when we started the International Center Against the Abuse of Covert Technologies, my whole purpose was to gather the data because a lot of it was just subjective. You've got subjective complaints. People are telling what they are experiencing, but there was nothing objective, concrete. And so common society today is taught to, when you have these type of complaints, what do? You go to your physician. And if you just briefly go over the symptoms that I was telling you that our agents and our diplomats were complaining about, a lot of the times they get brushed off and sent to go see someone in the mental health industry. And this is what was happening. And my belief, and the theory is of many others, not only Dr. John Hall, Dr. Robert Duncan, who is another author, and he helped develop some of this technology. He was the author of a book called Soul Catchers, and he realized what he was involved in, and morally, he felt that it was his obligation to tell the truth. And so he speaks out against these types of technologies that have been developed and now are on steroids with the advent of AI. And as we progress into brain computer interface technologies, we can get into that, and we probably will in depth here in this interview. But what I asked Dr. John Hall in the beginning is, why aren't we getting mass data? And he says, because people were afraid to come forth, because they were afraid to be labeled as having some type of psychosis or mental health disorder. So I decided to start testing anyone and everyone who was complaining about these symptoms in the United States. And how we tested this was because if this truly was tech, and because this was affecting individuals no matter where they went on the planet, as they've come forth and said, it's some type of signal. They believe it's some type of covert weapon. But if you use common sense and you say, well, if this is following them and they're having these symptoms wherever they go, if this is truly some type of signal-based technology, then we should be able to detect some type of RF emission. Now, the human body doesn't typically send out a RF emission normally. So what we decided to do was start doing RF scans of people utilizing what was called a JM20 Pro. And it was an general RF frequency detector. And you can calibrate it to be basically within an inch or two of the emission. And that's what was really unique about this equipment. And so that we can do preliminary scan on a mass scale. And we started in Sacramento, California, and literally over 100 people showed up. I was just shocked. And I go, okay, so this is interesting. And then our second event, over 300 people showed up, and they kept growing. And what we were finding initially is that in California, the predominant victims were Caucasian females, highly educated, single, divorced, or recently widowed. And then it fell from there. Then it went to Caucasian males, then African Americans in the same order, female males, and then the Asian community, and then it dwindled down in ethnicity as you continue to go through the data. We did the same thing in the Midwest, and again, to my surprise, the majority of the victims were all Caucasian. And so I was starting to wonder, why is that? But as I was invited towards the eastern part of the United States, it began to flip a little bit. Then it became predominantly African Americans, then Caucasians, then Asians, and then it dwindled down. And that was consistent all the way up onto the East Coast.
And were you able to find the source of the emission?
We are able to say this because it's an emission, and we were using an RF detector that's calibrated to find locations on the human body where it's detecting something. Okay, so we were able to find specific anatomical locations that these emissions were coming from. Okay, and as I continue to tell you, the last place that in the United States that I did this RF scanning, I was invited. It was about 100 or 130 people that showed up, and that was in Virginia. And what was interesting about this group, it was completely different than everything else we had experienced in the United States. They were all military subcontractors. And because I had been doing this for so long, I was objectively seeing something that was a phenomenon that was happening, that there were different classes of susceptibility between these victims. The ones that were most affected were those who were what I would call highly suggestible, or fall under high suggestibility within the scale of suggestibility. There's, depending on which study you're looking at, anywhere between 15 to 33% of the population is highly suggestible. And I want you to keep that in the back of your mind as I go ahead and explain what happened in Virginia. Now, when I opened up this meeting, I decided to open it up differently. I decided to ask the audience, I said, everyone that's here, can you please raise your hand if you think you're highly suggestible? And no one raised their hands. And then I asked everyone, if you think you are not highly suggestible, please raise your hand. And with the few exception of maybe one or two people, then everyone raised their hands. And what I did with this audience, as I began to ask everyone, why are you here? And that's when I found out they were all military subcontractors. And so what I decided to do was look within the audience and pick the most intimidating person to come up and speak with me in the middle of the room. And I began to talk to him. He was a gentleman who was pretty massive guy, really fit. He was African American, and he was about 6'5", 6'6", so very intimidating person. And we just began to chat there in the middle of the room, and his hands were put together. And by the time we were done, I asked him to pull his hands apart. And to his surprise, he couldn't. And the more he tried, the harder it was for him to do this. And he began to panic. And so this was not my intention. My intention was to demonstrate that you can be covertly affected if you have a high suggestibility. And this not only falls for these victims, but it's in the general society. This is a phenomenon that exists. So I went to him, just said sleep. So we sleep, use some positive affirmations to help him feel better about what was going on, acknowledging now that you understand that you might be highly suggestible. And I worked with them with a little bit and then woke them back up. And then when you ask them the question again, now I ask you, are you highly suggestible? He goes, well, I know now that I am. Okay. So, but what's interesting out of this group, right now, there are a couple of cases that are going through the court systems. In this group, there is a case that is made it up through the court systems and where I am an expert witness. And I can't disclose anything about these cases because of where they are in their lawsuits. But they were able to, based off our preliminary scans, and we have a methodology. You do a preliminary scan, you get medical imaging, any toxicology reports that can go along with this to substantiate higher levels of metals in you. These were all in the protocol, and then finally with where you go in what's called an anechoic chamber, and it's a very sophisticated Faraday cage in simple terms, but it blocks off huge frequency spectrums. And you bring these individuals in there, and then you do a frequency counter, and you can detect a signal in those areas that we did find emissions in the preliminary RF scans.
So that means
So
you put them into a device similar to the Faraday cage, and then you do a RF scan, and you find that the source of emission from inside of the human body.
there in the anechoic chamber, yes, it blocks off those frequencies from coming in, but they are emitting it. And here's the interesting thing: those from the United States all had similar frequency. Those in Europe had a different similar frequency. Those in Russia had a different frequency. Those in China, those in Korea. So that was an interesting finding that we've concluded. And I believe I gave you a copy of our phase 3 scanning report, and you can see the data that was found there. But yes. So also I forgot to mention that gentleman that I had come up in the middle of the room, who was a military subcontractor, was working on the AIDS virus. And so one would question, why is the military working on the AIDS virus? A lot of anecdotal information was coming over my experience. Now, this experience happened over, it was over a decade of doing this. I've now, up until recently, I sort of took a back door and just started doing my own research and working on some other topics. And this is why I became a hypnotherapist. I have been practicing hypnotherapy, or hypnosis, I should say, since the early 2000s. And when I started to see this phenomenon and why it's important that society is educated, because education is the first step in combating this. Initially, if you can imagine being your average person and you wake up one morning and you're hearing these strange sounds, you're going, what's going on? You're not feeling well. And you go wow, if I go tell my doctor this, I don't know what my doctor's going to say to me. He's just going to put me on medication. But that was the worst thing possible for these people, because it just re-victimizes them once again. Now, what are we finding? You have some images there. There are a couple cases that we can talk about the history and flow of this. There was a gentleman by the name of James Walbert who was successful in obtaining a restraining order. He found out that he was implanted, and they found an implant in his scapula area through an MRI scan. They ended up doing some further toxicology reports and found higher levels of metal in his body, unusual metals in his body. And
who did the implant? Did they find out?
He got the restraining order against who he believed did the implant. And the judges felt that there was enough circumstantial evidence to at least give the order. He believes it was someone who was trying to, if I recall this correctly, trying to steal information about an invention that he was working on.
Okay.
And that's what his complaint was. But the circumstantial story that was going around, to me, is irrelevant. What's more relevant is the fact that number one, you can see it in a medical study. B, number two, you have toxicology reports and medical reports to substantiate his claim. And number three, you have a judge who believed in enough in the circumstantial evidence to issue the order. So that was important there. But prior to James Walbert, there was another case down in Southern California by a gentleman by the name of David Larson. He is a politician at the time, and he was having unusual symptoms, electric shocks, basically everything that you see here. And he ended up filing a lawsuit against a medical company down in Southern California. And what they had found is that he had these implants, many of them. It was over 10 implants that were implanted throughout his body. Now, you have pictures there, and you can pull up the Dave Larson report. And when you look at the images, and this is the scary part, when you think about how far technology has come, these implants back in the 40s and 50s that the military was working on, and we got this information through the Freedom of Information Act, were about the size of a grain of rice. Now, if you look at the images, and this is over a decade ago, what was pulled out of Dave Larson, they were the size of the number of the date on a penny. Now they're even smaller than this. How do I know this? So when I was in Virginia, my wife went to school with a gentleman who was a typical overachiever. And he happened to work for the Pentagon. He was a military subcontractor. And he hadn't seen my wife since college. So he asked us to come stay with him in his house or visit them. And when he asked why we were there, I had mentioned briefly, not give him all the details about why we were there. I was invited to come and speak to everyone. And he had said, oh, well, we can tell you, depending on the implant, what year that they were being used. He goes, but now, if you're implanted, you're pretty much out of luck. He said they are so small now that not even medical imagery can detect these. So hence, the only way to detect this is through technology mechanisms. And hence, this is why we use the RF scanning procedures in order to initially detect these.
So what would be his theory of who originally put the implants in the people? Like who is that the military, or is this who did this?
Okay, well, there's a mixture. Some of them are medical facilities. Some are agencies that are hired by our government for research. And we do have a case like the Bob Boyce case. Bob Boyce was an inventor of a high efficiency engine, and he had a business partner. And when I spoke to Bob, Bob had terminal cancer, and he thought he said to me, he goes, Jesse, I had succumbed that I was going to die. But he said he was inside a Faraday cage, and because he was testing for RF leakage in the Faraday cage for his devices, and because he was detecting a leak and he didn't know where it was coming from. But by accident, the wand passed by his shoulder and it pinged. And so that was curious to him. So he went and got an X-ray, and in that X-ray, you could see a microchip that was in the tumor. And
the microchip in the tumor?
In the tumor, a microchip in the tumor, And you have images of those actual medical imagery that was done in that file. And what he had done then is they went and had surgery, pulled the tumor out. They had the microchip. It went to pathology. And I asked Bob, and I said, so what happened to the implant? And he said, it disappeared. So his story was this. He loved Mountain Dew. He was in his office one day and his business partner brought him a Mountain Dew. And then he lost track of time. He woke up 3 days later in his office, so he never left. So he knows to this day now that he was drugged by his business partner. And interestingly enough, his business partner worked as a former employee for the NSA. So Bob's cancer came back very aggressively, and I spoke to him again, and he said, Jesse, it's back. And I said, Bob, you better reconsider rescanning yourself. And so he scanned himself again, and they found another location. This time they approached it differently. They wanted to make sure that they maintain chain of custody. And so when they surgically removed this implant, which was in another tumor, they kept the chain of custody, the serial numbers, and they traced it back to an NSA database. And when they tried to sue and get more information, they were stonewalled. And this is what I was told, is that because it's an issue of national security. So this is why we know it's a variety of different agencies that are involved in this type of technology. Now, in Dave Larson's case, it was a medical facility.
Yeah.
He sued, but unfortunately, the judges threw that lawsuit out because they said he signed to participate in an experimental procedure. Unfortunately, this is why I'm an advocate for full disclosure. Whenever you give someone paperwork that they're going to participate in an experiment, it's important that they know every aspect of the experiment that's going to happen to them. Because I know in Bob's case, Dave's case, that if he was aware that they were going to implant these devices in him, there's no way he would have gone through with it. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes. Did you ever try to do a hypno regression to see what really happened during the 3 day when he was under?
No, we did not. And I'll tell you why. Back then, doing regression was the highest litigious aspect to a hypnotherapist, because you can bring back past traumas and so forth, and those things can be just adversely negative for the person. So the answer is no, but I would love to have done it, but I don't know if we're going to get much information from Bob because he was drugged. So probably if we regressed him, he's only going to recall the information up until he received the Mountain Dew. I highly suspect that. Now we have a different way of approaching regression. There's a thing called regression therapy. And in regression therapy, if that is an aspect in their past that subconsciously is important to bring forward, there's a technique to use that it will allow you to do that. So nowadays, I'm not as concerned as I was back then. So the answer, I have done it.
Yes.
I have done it with victims.
Yeah.
I don't think it's as advantageous as it is to getting objective data. So the RF scans, the medical imageries, and the type of scanning that can be done today is more important than anything if you think this is happening to you.
A lot of my audience would be interested to regress to their past lives because they read the book Theory of Prophecy, and they know they're not just this present life but also past lives. So I want to know who they were before. And have you ever tried to do any past life regression?
Yes, I've done it many times, and the thing is a very, very powerful tool. Not only what regression helps you with is if you believe in the theories, and there are many religions out there that believe that we reincarnate. Buddha, that one's the first one that comes to mind. Shamanism, everything. If you're dealing with issues in this present life term, whether it be you're claustrophobic, don't know why. You're afraid of heights, don't know why. You're afraid of fire, you don't know why. Spiders, whatever. it can be very beneficial because when you go to past lives, I can give you stories where we had a gentleman who was very claustrophobic, and we regressed him. And strangely enough, in his previous lives, he was murdered. Each in several of his previous lives, and one of them he was backed into an alleyway, sort of I could describe it as an alleyway, and he was cornered and stabbed. The other one he was crushed in a car, murdered and still alive, but thrown in the back of a vehicle and then crushed in the vehicle. Once he came to realization in those past lives that that had happened, when we regressed him back, the claustrophobia went away. So we have many stories where we've had that type of incident happen. So it is very beneficial for a lot of people. And then
Another
some people
question.
just, yeah, go ahead. And then some people just want to know, who was I in the past life?
Yes. A
Yeah.
lot of my
So
friends want to know this. And what's the
yes.
percentage of the success rate that people can regress to their past lives? Like for example, myself, I went to at least 2 or 3 hypnotherapists, and I wasn't able to I wasn't able to be hypnotized for one reason or another, because I probably English is not my first language, but
Mhm.
there may be other reasons too. What's your success rate?
I haven't had a person that I could not regress yet. And I always say this. I'm fortunate. I went to the first accredited college for hypnotherapy in the United States. I was very fortunate to be taught under Dr. Kappas. And he actually developed uh, a way of testing individuals' suggestibility. So that's the first step we have to assess. There's a thing called emotional suggestibility and physical suggestibility, and what percentages do you fall under? And depending on what your dominant suggestibility trait is, there are techniques and procedures in how you approach hypnosis with the individual. So if you're a physical, you can use more like direct commands. If you're an emotional, you have to totally take a different approach. You have to use an inference approach where you're making inferences to help them get in a meditative state or a deep hypnotic state to where you can access the subconscious. I've always found is as long as you have an IQ greater than a second, third grader, you can be hypnotized. And the more intelligent you are, the higher your IQ, the easier it is to hypnotize you.
I always find it fascinating and interesting, because like for me, I tried it. Maybe I'll try it with you sometime in the future. But when I was at UC Berkeley, when they were having Christian congregation services or ceremonies, I wasn't able to really participate, because my fellow students, they were kind of singing songs, hallelujah, or things like that, dancing and things like that. I was always like a bystander. Like I wasn't able to really go into their kind of emotional state. I was
Yes. Yeah.
always alert. I don't know. Maybe I'm
Yeah.
a very high-strung person. I don't know.
No. Yeah. Like I said, it would be interesting to find out where your dominant uh, suggestibility trait is.
Yeah.
My sense is that you probably won't fall under the highly suggestible. You'll probably be somewhere on the low moderate suggestibility, but it doesn't mean you can't go into hypnosis. Um, the bottom line is like I said, it really is about the approach.
So back to the Havana Syndrome. So what you're suggesting is that there may be some kind of secret weapon that's projecting a kind of a wavelength of signals to the people, targeting individuals. And then especially the people who are mostly suggestible, they're prone to having this kind of weapon having effect on them. So what would be the rest of the people who are not suggestible? Do they have symptoms, or are they okay, or is this weapon like targeted to a specific group of people or people having common traits?
Okay. So The reason I address the high suggestibility issue with these victims is because there are a couple of cases here in the United States. One was Aaron Alexis, and then the other one was Myron May. One of them, they both contacted me before they did this horrible, horrific act. They went and there was a Navy Yard shooting. I think like 16 people were killed there. And then down in Florida, there was the university, or people were killed in the research department. Now, this was happening to them. They were complaining of these symptoms. But and when this happens in the beginning, you're in a fight or flight state. And so you're either in constant fear or you're angry about what you believe has happened to you. Both of them were in this state, but I can tell that they were determined to do something. They were impatient. I explained to them, yes, I can help you, but this isn't a quick fix. This is a long-term journey, but you're going to need to do some steps. And neither one of them wanted to go through that process. So they went and acted out themselves. They were highly suggestible. And so I found that this is a subgroup that we need to address and bring resources to immediately. The secondary group, and all of them are just as important, it would be those who are in the moderately to high suggestibility. Now, I want you to think about this. If you look throughout history of non-consensual experimentation we have done, not only here in the United States, but throughout the world. We can talk about the LSD experiments in San Francisco. We can talk about the Tuskegee experiments where they were giving syphilis to African-American men and letting it run rampant. They're back in the East Coast where they took these children and told them they had speech impediments, even though they were perfectly healthy. And before you know it, all these children had developed speech impediments. Ewan Cameron, who is the one I like to talk about now, because when you look at what he was doing, the United States was giving funding so that he can develop a way to reprogram the human brain. And so they were looking at ways and techniques to erase memories and to re-implant false memories in them. And they were using a technique called psychic driving, where they'd put a helmet over the head after drugging them and play tape recordings over and over and over again. Now let's take the advancement in technology. What these diplomats were complaining about is hearing a signal. Now you get someone who's highly suggestible and you've done this to them, you can get them to act out like the Aaron Alexises and the Myron Mays. Okay. Now this is a very small percentage, but the fact is, what about those in general society who are completely unaware that this is there and they have these devices in them and are unaware and wondering why their life is so unstable? What happens when it's being done to them? So basically, with the advent of technology and AI, you can transmit 24/7, 47 days, our yearly term, 24/7. Eventually, the psychic driving is going to take. So this is why it's important that we are out there now, because this phenomenon is being broadcasted everywhere. 60 Minutes had just done a whole segment on the Havana Syndrome.
Let me ask you, has there been any efforts, or have there been any efforts to find the source of the emission of the signals? Is it from the implants in the body, or is it like an outside source near the embassies, has there been any research around that?
Okay, so our approach is a little bit different than what's being put out there on the mainstream. They're saying it's some type of EMP weapon, some type of electromagnetic frequency that's being emitted. But I want you to use common sense here. When you emit a frequency, it goes everywhere. Okay?
Yeah.
So that's fine. Do these technologies exist? Yes. But in order for it to signal out and find an individual, the individual has to have a mechanism to receive that signal. And this was the common sense approach if our theory was correct. And so when we started doing these RF scans and started finding these emissions at specific focal points on the human body, okay, and it was happening time and time again, specifically with the people who were having the symptomatic complaints, you start to develop a picture based on the data. It no longer becomes subjective, but it starts to become objective. And then when you have supporting medical imagery in some of the cases that had older technology because they were large enough to be detected by medical imagery, that was great supporting evidence. And then but it's still considered a foreign body until it's removed. And then when you're having these removed, you find out these are medical devices of different sorts, or transducers or RFID chips. There's a couple of cases. One case is with your traditional RFID chip. The other cases tend to be these little implants that are the size of a grain of rice and smaller. And that's where we're headed.
So it has to be like a source and also a device receiving the signals in the body. So for the people who were implanted, what should they do? Like any solutions or suggestions that what they should do to remove the implants or any other better means?
Well, number one, you have to be very, very careful. Although this is not a new phenomenon, it's been happening for quite some time. Our suggestion is always this, if you think this is happening to you, I caution you, you have to be very conservative at how you approach this. You have to use a methodology that you could substantiate. So it's important if you start to have these types of symptoms, particularly if it's the newer technology where they're the size smaller than a grain of rice, you're really going to have to get an RF scan. There are types of scans that will send a resonant frequency to these devices because some are active and some are passive. And then it will echo back a couple of times and it will detect ferrous material. So metals that shouldn't be in your body. And it will activate these that will send that signal and then you can scan. You have a perfect example. I just uploaded a report on one of these scans into your file that you can share with your audience. And it shows you exactly specifically what I'm talking about. Now, it's important that you're careful because why do they use this methodology? If you go to your medical physician and you start to complain about these things, and not in all the cases, some may have some mental disorder, but most of the time they don't. And they're perfectly sane and they're just in fear. They're not understanding what's going on. But you need to use a different approach. Once you get the scans, my recommendation is get a toxicology report to see if you do have high levels of metal in you. Don't lie to your doctors or your psychiatrist if you're seeing one, or counselors. You just want to tell them the symptoms. Don't give them the theory. Let them come up with a conclusion. But as you continue to gather evidence, there are some facilities, not many in the United States. A lot of them get threatened for removing these devices, saying that it is not their property, and they get threatened with their medical license being revoked. But there are some other countries that you can go and have these removed from.
Like which countries?
There are places in Europe and the land down under. Like I said, I have to be careful because I don't want to talk. I don't want to affect any pending cases that are happening right now.
Got it. Yeah,
and there's going to be actually a big law case in the first quarter of next year through the EU. There is a huge human rights lawsuit that is going to be made public with regards to this issue.
I mean, this seems to be a very serious ethical issue. They're doing things that are unethical, putting implants on the people without permission, and also projecting signals in order to affect people's mind. It's kind of like a new mind control program.
It is. It's on steroids, and this is why I mentioned you encountering with the psychic driving. This is psychic driving on steroids. If you get the right subject, you can get them to basically do anything, and they won't remember. And we've done some demonstrations where, you know, some of these victims, they talk about someone breaking into their home, unlocking their doors, undoing their windows, when it was in fact them. And I demonstrated it through hypnosis how they can do it and not remember. But just think about it. You know,
Imagine how dangerous it is if someone did this to our president or
correct.
Secretary of State, or maybe other senior government officials, or maybe other leaders of other countries. This is a very dangerous situation. I mean, like, who is doing this? I mean, is this like the NSA, or is it something other more covert?
Well, we do know that in the David Larson case, that was a medical company that was doing experimentation. They were not giving full disclosure. In Bob Boyce case, it was a previous NSA employee. In most of the cases we're finding, it is going to be medical facilities who are doing experimentation. Where did I want to go with this? It's important that you show your viewers the William Pollock video. Now, you have a link in there, and William Pollock actually helped and was involved with this type of technology. And he talks about billions of these chips being developed in Silicon Valley and disappearing, and they have no idea where they went to. It's important that they see that video because it's very enlightening. Now, this was done a long time ago, and he didn't disclose. He wanted his video disclosed after his death. My assumptions are so he didn't get in any trouble or locked up in prison. But it's important that education is first and foremost the first weapon against this. Because if you don't know what's going on, you don't know what to do, right? But just being educated and knowing, it gives you the ability to protect yourself. And knowledge is the first step in protecting yourself. That's the first step. Now, if someone is highly suggestible, there are some techniques using hypnotherapy. It's funny. Being high suggestibility is a double-edged sword. You can be easily manipulated, but using that ability to be highly suggestible can be your superpower.
How can we turn it into our superpower? What would be the steps to do that?
Yes, it basically is learning how to utilize self-empowerment, self-hypnosis, critical thinking, all of those skills, but with the help of a hypnotherapist or the utilization of self-hypnosis, you can begin to bring the scale of suggestibility over to a more moderate to normal level. And in my book, we talk about those techniques. Now, we're doing an event called Mind Nexus Live. And the event was, because typically what in this phenomenon, it's usually the victims who are surrounded like this. And they're unfortunately, they have been labeled in a very negative connotation. But for some reason, when we talk about the Havana Syndrome and the fact that they're exactly the same symptoms, the general society is now, I think, ripe to at least embrace the fact that this may be a possibility. And with the advent of Homeland Security now admitting that this phenomena does exist, but when you look at the video of their testimony, when they're asked about the general population, they sort of infer that it's happening, but they sidestep it. They won't address it directly. They only talk about federal employees and diplomats. I hope that
Yes.
helps.
Yeah,
I hope
that
that
helps.
helps. Yeah, yeah.
Can you just give me a little bit of flavor on how people can like self-hypnotize themselves to empower themselves? Like what would they do? Do they have to, can they do it on their own or just they need
Well,
someone else?
there's a lot of techniques out there. There are a lot of self-help books on self-hypnosis. On YouTube, there's a lot of guided meditation on self-hypnosis. And when you start to understand and become very effective with it, it's your subconscious mind that is really in control. A lot of us think that our conscious mind is the one that makes all decisions, but it's not. Your conscious mind basically is all the value systems that you've been raised with culturally, through your educational system, through your friends and your experiences, and then you develop your objective ways of processing information. Now, the unconscious or your subconscious mind is different. It's like a hard drive. It just records everything. It takes it all in, and whatever it's programmed with, it's going to spew out. And I'm doing this in very simplistic layman's terms. So there's a gentleman by the name of Dr. Richard Bandler, who developed neurolinguistic programming. He describes as this. Um, uh, Bandler and Granger actually developed neurolinguistic programming. It's a university out of San Francisco where it started, but it's proliferated worldwide. But he explains it as this: the human being has never been taught how to reprogram bad programming in your neurons. With hypnosis, you can use positive affirmations, positive programming to reprogram that neuron. And basically, this is at your subconscious level. When you reprogram it, your output is completely changed. And that is the philosophy behind hypnotherapy, hypnosis, guided meditation, self-hypnosis, trance work, breathing techniques. These are all things to get your mind in a different trance,
Great.
if that
Thank you.
explains it again.
Great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And tell us about your upcoming event, what you'll be speaking about and what the event is like.
Yeah. So we're really excited about this. We wanted a way to teach the general population who was not aware of these things, and disseminate this information in a way that can be palatable. Now, with the advent of, for example, what I'm talking about is the domestic Havana Syndrome victims that have been here for quite some time. They need a voice and they need resources. And this is the first step in educating the general population, because you as yourself, you can conceive the ideas and you can see how it has some consequential issues with regards to human rights, autonomy, and the self-preservation, that the ability to make decisions on what happens to your own person. These are all important topics. So what we were able to do is get a conglomeration of different experts from different fields. Dr. John Hall will be there speaking. We have Dr. Alex Bloom, who's a psychologist, who will talking about aspects and setting the atmosphere so that people understand that this is a real phenomenon. This is not a conspiracy theory, although I find that funny because the word conspiracy theory is also mind control. They created a connotation in a negative way that you're a tinfoil hat person if you're a conspiracy theorist. But how many cases are being tried currently in the United States based on a conglomeration of people conspiring to do some type of criminal act? Conspiracy is a crime. And so anyway, so we have many experts there in different fields and backgrounds that will disclosing the truths. And that's the emphasis of our event. We have some spiritualists for the spiritualism movement. It's important that we understand that leading with love, leading with kindness, leading with respect is our next transition in humanity, and to become a collective consciousness, and where we're doing things that accelerate the meaning of being human, and why we're here. What is your objective? What is your purpose? And I want to close with a story before I finish here. We'll also have John D'Souza. I don't know if you've heard the name John D'Souza, but John D'Souza was a retired FBI agent, and he was a huge contributor to the program called X-Files. Now, X-Files was all based on true stories. John D'Souza, my understanding is that when he was going through the FBI, for whatever reason, he was assigned to these type of cases. And so he will also be present. And I think the timing's right with the types of stories that true events that he will be disclosing. There's a lot in the science community that's happening. For those who are following Skinwalker Ranch, there's a lot of phenomena happening there with the UAPs that they're documenting using scientific method. And what's interesting, a lot of what they're doing has to do with frequencies. They're detecting frequencies. And ultimately what we're doing is we're bringing a group of speakers that will spearhead and bring in large crowds, so that we can not only demonstrate, I will be demonstrating exactly the phenomenon that I described to you that I did with this military subcontractor. Taking people from the audience who believe that they're not suggestible and showing them that the possibility of them being highly suggestible is probably real. So we'll be doing things like that.
Great. When is this event, and where is it going to be located?
Yeah, it's going to be located in Tucson, Arizona, September 27th through the 29th. It's a 3-day event. Right now, normally it's $444, but right now we're doing a 4th of July special. If you go to mynexuslive.com, you can subscribe and put in a code, MindNexGo, MINDNEX GO, and you will get a huge discount. It'll bring the price down to like $377. Now, it's a 3-day event, includes catered dinner on 2 nights and a cocktail party and DJ, so everyone can engage with the speakers and network with everyone with like minds. Ask any questions that you want, and that's what the whole event is.
Great. A lot of very well-known speakers are going to be present too, as far as I know, like
yes,
Carrie Cassidy and
Carrie Cassidy, yes, of Project Camelot.
Yes.
Ben Chastain, with huge following. So we're really excited about this event.
Great. Great, Jesse, thank you so much for the information, and I think the audience will be enlightened, and will look it up to the event. And
also, if you go to our website, mynexuslive.com, there is a link, and it says suggestibility. If you go to that link, you can test yourself on and see what your score is for physical suggestibility and emotional suggestibility. And if you fall under the high suggestibility, it'll automatically flag you, and then it'll send us an email. But it's something, if you're wanting to learn something introspectively about yourself, it's a great opportunity, and it's all for free.
Great. Thank you so much. And we'll speak soon next time.
Okay. My pleasure, Sam.
Great. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.